Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to share the stage with these two scholar writers, as I've been telling them since the time I met them a couple of hours ago, Ranjit Hoskote and Srinivas Reddy, and who've actually dedicated themselves to, what should I say, what exactly, what's the right word here? You know? Sharing? No, I'm something bigger than that.
I think, if I may just speak for both of us, I think what drives and inspires both these books is a deep sense of responsibility
No, that's
to
too
a
big.
tradition.
That's too big.
What's that? That's too big?
Yeah.
Something in between sharing and
Blessing.
responsibility.
Let's say
How's blessing?
no. Let's say bringing India's cultural and literary heritage, simplifying it enough for the modern audiences. I think that's simple enough. Because I know because I know your answers are going to be, in any case, as big as what you said just now about yourself. So, what is it? Yes. No, but well, there's a whole lot of there are more than you out there, so that's why. Anyway, I've got a bunch of questions that are fairly generic, though we are planning to discuss these books here. One is Illuminating Minds. If you can hold it, Srinivas. This is his book that we're going to be talking about, and Ranjit's book is. So, what I have done is very cleverly, if I may say so, prepared a list of questions that I'll be addressing to both of them, and they can give their take on those answers according to the books that they've written. So yeah, the first question is, both your anthologies cover a vast expanse of time and literary traditions. How did you navigate the challenge of deciding what to include and what not to? Ranjit, you. Ranjit, or whoever. You may toss.
Okay. Yeah, one of the great challenges of any anthology is deciding what to include, because you know that you will not be able to include everything, and that no matter what choice you make, you will have left something out. So in this book, I wanted to choose kind of the ones that people would say, how could you not have included that?
That makes sense.
How could you have not included something from the Ramayana or the Mahabharata or the Vedas or the Upanishads? So that kind of created the core of selections. And then I wanted to add a few things that people would have said, oh, I didn't even realize that fits under classical literature. So something like, the Jain Ramayana, for example, or Therigatas, things like that. So I think that was the biggest consideration, is how to balance the greatest hits that everyone would expect with a couple of, nice gems that people might not have expected. And just a small point on the, simplifying things. I don't think I've simplified anything. I translate very authentically to the text, and I believe the complexities and the subtleties that are available in the text are there for a modern reader to kind of, as Ma'am was saying, read into and feel that. So I didn't want to simplify anything. I was recently on a panel with some other translators who worked on Sanskrit poetry that simplified things. And I didn't find that actually that invigorating. I think I want to give my audience, my readers, a chance to bring their intelligence, their creativity, their interpretation to those poems, which I think are replete with that kind of potentiality. So in that sense, I do like to stick to the text and allow them to really speak for themselves as much as possible.
Which is why I think these endeavors are really not about bringing things down to the level of anybody. It's, if anything, these anthologies are about inviting people into worlds that were complex, that were rich, that were multi-layered. So in that context, 10 Indian classics is actually, I have to say, a collective effort. There are people who don't particularly want to be named, but I want to give them a shout out. There's this amazing team at Harvard University Press, Sharmila Sen, Heather Hughes, and Samantha Mateo. It's the work of all of us, as well as the editors and translators who've worked for 10 years on the Murthy Classical Library of India. So what you're seeing here is the outcome of the work of all of these people. And that's very much in the spirit of our traditions, which were traditions of collegiality and collaboration. It's not about the individual, it's about a set of contributors. So what this anthology is, in one sense, in a creative, constructive way, limited by, is the fact that it celebrates the first decade of the Murthy Classical Library of India. And the extracts are all drawn from volumes that have been published in that series. So what we wanted to do was to really bring into play as wide a spread as we could, given that we'd set the constraint of 10 extracts for ourselves. We wanted to bring in a range of languages. It's 2,500 years of Indian literary history, and it's a huge topography that we're covering. So, which is why you have Pali and Sanskrit, you have Kannada and Telugu, you have Braj and Awadhi, Persian and Urdu. The whole point of that was really to think about how this country and its culture have always been distinguished by plurality, by diversity, by the coming together of very, very dissimilar energies. So at one end you have the Therigatha, the first Buddhist women, their various hymns and reflections brought into Pali out of the various prior languages that they were in. So you have these witnesses from 2.5 millennia ago speaking in a way that resonates for us still, whether it's in terms of class or renunciation or gender. There's all of these seemingly very, very contemporary disquiets that you find people, women, talking about at that point. At the other end of the scale, you have the Guru Granth Sahib, itself an anthology. You also have Mir Taqi Mir, that's the very last, the latest horizon in the book. So it's also with a view to thinking about how very polyphonic our literary culture is and how multilingual we always have been. And in one sense, this anthology is intended as a modest argument against the forms of narrowness to which we've condemned ourselves today in terms of linguistic, regional, and ethnic identities. And how might we overcome them when we stand in the presence of this incredible heritage?
A few minutes ago, we were talking about translation, and you mentioned that, very proudly, very happily, that I translated everything. So I'd like to address this question to you. What is your philosophy of translation? How do you balance fidelity to the original text, when you're translating, and also making it accessible to contemporary readers? How do you balance that?
Well, that's the big question of good translating, the balance of, felicitous expression in the target language with a commitment to being accurate and close enough to the original that you are not disrupting that kind of original meaning. So that's a long, big process of many decisions. But I'll just say one thing about it. Before I start, one thing I think that is special about this book is that I translated everything in this book in 6 different languages, 3 major literary traditions.
There should be
No, you
some.
don't need to clap about that.
Please.
Please just read the book.
That is really huge.
Please just read the book. I really thank my gurus for giving me the chance to learn all these languages. But no matter what text it was, what language, the key for me in really making good translations, particularly of Indian literature, is you have to read the originals deeply. You have to circulate those sounds and those rhythms in your mind like a song, that comes into you. And then it kind of flows out in English in a certain way. So the main thing is really keeping a mind to sound and meter, and of course the meaning as well, but really like the sonic nature of how Indian verse is created. And keeping that in my mind as I translate into English, I think is one of the key things to my process. And then also, and this has to do with kind of like what we were talking about, the accessibility and the poeticness of it all, is I do think you really have to think about register. There's a different register when you're translating a Vedic hymn as opposed to a Kalidasa. Even though they're both in Sanskrit, they're very different in their register, in their modality of, perceiving the world, perceiving the use of the words. So all of that has to kind of come into play as we think through the translations.
What about you, Ranjit? You did Mir.
I have to clarify that none of my translations are in this,
No, but
in
you've
this
done
particular anthology.
translations.
Say
Yeah,
again.
but you've done translations.
Yeah,
Yes.
so specifically, fantastic points. Thank you, Srinivas. I mean, it enriches the field of conversation. But just a brief word on my practice. It's hybrid. I'm a poet who also translates, and who, in this responsibility to MCLI, I'm also editing, working with other translators. So in each of these cases, I find precisely this, that what comes first is a certain deep musicality. There is cadence, there's beat. The fact that we remember these things after 2,000 years is because there's a deep visceral appeal. And many of these forms, we now just use the word poetry, but some of them come from wisdom traditions, some from sacred song, some from sacrificial protocols. And in each of these, there is in fact a different register. And we have to be attentive to that register and to figure out a corresponding form in the language to which we bring this. So just a couple of points that I want to make in that context. I think that we really should, one of my pet peeves, I am sick and tired of the usual model of the source language and the target language. Yeah. Because in the first place, there's a deeply extractivist military metaphor there. Source, something you rob. Target, something you shoot at. The fact is that these source languages are reservoirs that give of themselves generously. We have to approach them in a spirit of humility. And when we deal with our own language, in our case, English, that is not a static and sovereign language. It also changes on impact with what we're bringing through. And I think these are things that we really need to be attentive to. And also to think through the fact that the so-called source languages have not been unitary and unchanging throughout their history. Sanskrit, as we all know, is shorthand. There is no single Sanskrit. It changes. There's Rig Vedic Sanskrit. There's the classical Sanskrit of the Gupta era. There's middle hybrid Sanskrit in which many of the Buddhist long sutras are written. There is something that I'm very excited right now. I'm editing a marvelous translation of the Vetala Panchavimshati, the 25 tales of the Vetala. I've never read anything like it. It's a very late Sanskrit that really tips over into vernacularization, as it's called. So there are some verses in that translation where I think, I'm not approaching this through my work in Sanskrit. I'm thinking through the ear of someone who listens to Tumri and Tappa. There's Gujarati, there's Malvi, which you see coming to birth. So sorry to go on at such length, but it's also to make the point that translation is excitement.
Please, yes, please. No, it's really beautiful what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense too. Yeah. No, carry on, finish.
No, that was really it. Just to relay the fact that whilst of course there's a great deal of labor in the library and the archive and looking at recensions and making concordances, there's also just a visceral goosebumps excitement about translation.
Thank you so much. We needed those goosebumps. Yeah, so now given the sheer diversity of Indian classical literature, how do you ensure a fair representation of various languages, regions, and traditions in your anthologies?
Okay. Well, I think maybe if we can...
And how do you think this multiplicity has shaped the identity of Indian literature, I think? You can combine the two.
I mean, multiplicity is the word. Plurality is the word. I mean, that is the defining feature that we can all, as Indians, feel very proud about and that we must celebrate every day. Because even though the literature in Ranjitji's anthology covers a later period of time, which we consider, like the post-vernacularization period. So you have even a larger number of literary languages coming into existence, like Telugu, Awadhi, or any of these modern languages that we have, even in the ancient period, we have a very critical confluence of multiple literary classical traditions. So we have Sanskritam, which we all know. I mean, generally, if you ask somebody, you're writing about classical Indian literature, they'll think it's just a book about Sanskrit literature. That is not true. Classical Indian literature really has three big streams, and that's probably the biggest point I wanted to make in this book. So you have Sanskritam, definitely, but you have an entire multiplicity of Prakrit language traditions. Now, Prakrit is not a singular language. There are multiple Prakrits, particularly used by Buddhist Jains and other people, like the Gatha Saptasati, if you've read, very important Prakrit text. And then you have Tamil, which is a classical language with an independence of the great Sanskrit tradition that needs to be taken into account. And the real beauty of all of this classical literature is the ability and the history by which these three streams were interacting with each other, influencing each other, coming together in ways that, are not obvious on the surface. But when you dig deep a little bit, you see the shared metaphors moving from one tradition to another. You see these tropes coming up in odd and interesting ways in another language, and you say, how did that happen? And then you kind of trace it back and say, oh, yes, this came from this, and yes, this seems to have influenced this Prakrit. Oh, yes, and this person was writing in Gujarat, and this person was writing in Maharashtra. Okay, like that. Making those kinds of connections and seeing that inherent kind of interactive dynamism that was happening, I think is the key to really all of our traditions, even at this early period in the history.
Your take,
which again
Ranjit?
is kind of multiplied when we move into the vernacular period.
Yeah. Your take, Ranjit, on this. You must add something to it.
I'm hugely excited by what you said, Srinivas. So,
Keep going.
no, it's precisely this fact that whichever phase of our literary, linguistic, cultural history you look at, whatever snapshot you take, it is a history of migrations. It is a history of people taking their ideas, their gods, their doubts, their traumas around the subcontinent. And it is out of that which all of these texts come. I mean, I'm thinking of the Guru Granth Sahib, which is one of the extracts here. It's a great anthology that draws on the Sant traditions, on the wisdom traditions. So it has all the gurus, but it also has somebody like Namdev, who is a bhakti saint from the Western country, writing originally in Marathi. And you might say to yourself, how did this chap go all the way up there? The fact is that many of us, and even in our own family and birth community histories, we've started in one place and our ancestors migrated somewhere else. So I tend to think that it's this awareness of the mobile plural India that we've lost in modern times. It's actually the downside of a modernity premised on a singular nation state, well-defined regions with their boundaries, states with their boundaries. This is really not how it was. Also, texts can have lives in multiple languages. That's the other thing that excites me, which is why I'm always wary of the term versions that sometimes we also fall into using. So this myth or text has multiple versions. I far prefer something that a dear old mentor of mine, A.K. Ramanujan, used to say, tellings. Yeah. He always used to say, no versions, these are tellings. So whether it proceeds from a high Brahmanical perspective, or whether it comes from a subaltern Dalit milieu, whether it's the Pandit or the Yakshagana performer or whoever it is, all of those Ramayanas are tellings with their own potency, their own energy, and their own relevance. Right. The critical edition is a modern invention, and only scholars have ever read it. It actually means nothing in the lived experience of many of these texts. Yeah. So these books of ours, I like to think, take their life in this larger life of song, prayer, performance, debate. Yeah. So I think that's how, for me at least, these productions that we bring onto the printed page, they need to be seen in this much larger life world.
And actually, you mentioned about recurring motifs, Can you just kind of give an example to show how, when you mentioned that there are recurring motifs in various...
Yeah. Well, like one classic one that my teacher used to always tell me is, there's a trope, we often find of the bee getting stuck inside the lotus during the day and then getting stuck at night because it closes and then waiting for the first rays of sunlight. Now, we find this in old Tamil literature, long, long back, before we find it in any Sanskrit kavya. Now, I'm not saying that it necessarily came from Tamil, but there is an idea of a shared kind of Indian, pan-Indic kind of consciousness of poetic ideas that both of these traditions were likely drawing on. And I think things like that, I could give you a lot of examples. Things like that, little things like that you don't pick up necessarily unless you start reading all the poems together in kind of conversation with each other. A lot of times there'll be a Tamil anthology, so you just read the Tamil. There'll be a Sanskrit anthology, you just read that, whatever. But if you put them together, you start to get a different picture. One thing that I really wanted to add, I love what you're saying. It's just, we could go on for hours about this stuff. But, the fact that we've kind of lost this idea in a certain way, at least in the consciousness of the movement of people, of the diversity of things, I hope that these books will show that this has been going on for a very long time. We know in our own lives that it happens every day. When we interrogate our own lives, we know that. We've all moved somewhere, have family somewhere, have multiple languages in our lives. Hopefully these poems will inspire us to kind of just think back more on how our own lives remain mobile, diverse, and interactive. Yeah.
So you mentioned about how the interpretations of these classics have evolved over the years. How do you see your work contributing to this ongoing process? Is there more evolution happening in future, or how do you see, where do you place your work in this entire scene of evolution?
Yeah.
For me, what's a very compelling image is that of the river of commentary. Yeah, I'm thinking here of the great tradition of bhashya, using here a Sanskritic term, but you have exactly that same kind of commentatorial tradition in all our languages. Texts come to be viewed, revisited, reinterpreted, and those of us who inherit them in the present inherit not only the text, but also this great body of literature, of critical commentary on the subject. So I tend to think that these anthological efforts of ours in the present, although in a language that has been here for a slightly shorter period than some of the other languages, builds into that tradition of what it means to be a bhashyakar, I think. And in that context, I often think of how you don't necessarily have to write your commentary in the language of the text that you're commenting on. And from my point of view, for instance, I often think of the efforts of Dara Shikoh, who may have perished politically, but his cultural legacy lives on in a certain way. In a very strange way, this man, this Mughal prince, was actually a late commentator on the Upanishads. Yeah, it's through his efforts in many ways that we have this sense of the further circulation of the Upanishads. So his commentary is first in Persian, that gets translated into Sanskrit. So, to answer your question briefly, I think that these anthologies will take their place in this tradition of renewed attention to what is deepest and most abiding in our heritage.
Yeah. And what's your take, Srini, on this? Would you like to add something?
No, that's perfect.
That's a good one. Okay, so next is, how do you see these classical texts speaking to modern audiences? Are there any particular themes or values that you feel that resonate across centuries, because those are the ones that are going to be transmitted.
No, I think that's part of what classic literature is. To me, it's addressing fundamental questions of humanity. Yeah. Things like love, loss, fear, all of these things that all of us still experience every day. And they resonate. And maybe we could do some reading or something. Yeah. So let me think of a good one. I mean, some of my most favorite poetry in this collection is the Tamil Sangam literature, particularly the Aham poems. Aham poems. They're the poems of love, which of course A.K. Ramanujan was the master of. So I'll read one out. It's always hard to choose which one to read, you know. The beauty of these poems is that they're very dialogic. So it's like almost like we're eavesdropping on a domestic situation where a girlfriend is talking to her girlfriend, or a mother is talking to her daughter. So let me find all right. Here's a Kurundahai 300. It's a Kurinji poem. So they're set in different landscapes, which, due to that landscape, they come with their own resonances, their own particular flowers and trees and animals, which, you know, again, you have to be kind of in the know with the tradition. But even without that, I think a lot of the images and feelings you'll, appreciate. What he said to her: "Do not fear, my dark young beauty. The tiny pale spots spread across your dark body are like golden pollen dust from deep lotus ponds. Your thick black hair is fragrant with blue water lilies, and your honey-sweet red lips carry the fragrance of white water lilies. Believe me when I ask you not to fear. For even if I were to have the whole earth encircled by the high seas and sand dunes where tall geese with short legs play, I would not even think of letting go of your love." Wow. I mean, love is eternal. So it's like these poems will always resonate. Yeah.
How about you? Something from you, Ranjit?
Just to pick up on that amazing Sangam literature, there are so many things that resonate for us today. Just the fact that there was such a particularity in those landscapes. Whilst today, when we think about landscape, it is, for lack of another word, out of a colonial imagination. So, and our Draft Forest Act is a sinister tribute to that, where essentially we're thinking of forests as plantations. We tend to think that wetlands are a waste of time, scrubland is where we should be building. We don't realize that all of these are ecosystems which have immense impact on our biodiversity. And if you turn to the Sangam literature, you find that just the fact that these landscapes are delineated in the way they are, it also teaches us to respect these different forms of landscape and the species that inhabit them. So there's still a lesson for how to be good tenants of the planet, in one sense. Yeah. I might just read something from Charles Hallisey's amazing translation of the Therigatha, yeah? In the same spirit of how some things might yet be relevant.
Yeah. I did some Therigatha in this too, so yeah. I mean, it's amazing. This is the oldest and the first collection of women's verse ever made. Something we can be proud of. Yeah.
Things that we can genuinely be proud of instead of having to invent things and transpose them into the past. So these are verses named for the nuns that are being addressed, or address themselves. Veera, addressing herself, repeating what was spoken by the Buddha to her. The name you are called by means hero, Veera. It's a good name for you. Because of your heroic qualities, you are a nun who knows how to know well. Take care of your body. It's your last. Just make sure it doesn't become a vehicle for death after this. Mutta, or Mukta as one might say. The name I am called by means freed. And I am quite free. Well, free from three crooked things: mortar, pestle, and husband with his own crooked thing. I am freed from birth and death. What leads to rebirth has been rooted out.
I mean, look at the humor even in a poem like that. This is in the middle of a woman talking about basically the step before her nirvana. You know, and it's amazing and a lot of the Terigata poems discuss, you know, the kind of frustration with domestic life, which I'm sure many people still feel today. So they're very fresh. That's the thing. When you read them, I feel them to be very fresh. I don't think of classical stuff as stilted and old and irrelevant. It resonates. It's powerful.
Yeah, part of the reason we are trained, I think, to see these things as remote may come out of a certain pedagogy,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
instills a kind of an unquestioning reverence. But, you know, if you go to a Chitrakati performance, these texts are a basis. They're like a score for music, and then people are improvising. They're bringing in problems of the present. There's critique, there's satire, there's vulgar humor, if you will. All of that, all the rasas are present. So there's a way of seeing these texts that have come to us as philological fossils. And that is, from my point of view, at least an unfortunate mistake. We have to see them as bringing to us their spirit, and we have to animate them with ours.
This is, and you know, since we were discussing earlier about your interdisciplinary approach, I mean, your background, music for you, poetry for you, and art critique for you, how has that helped in your work? How has that helped in your work in these anthologies? Your background of music, for instance, yours of poetry and art critique, for instance.
Yes, you know, when you were talking.
Yeah, because you were talking of poetry.
Yeah, well,
and
as I mentioned before, a big part of translating for me is to read the verses over and over again in my mind with the rhythm and that sonic quality. But when you were just talking about, let us take a text like the Ramayana, you know, huge. We think Valmiki, that's it. You know, this big, beautiful text. Okay, that's there. But that's not where the Ramayana lives. The Ramayana lives when people enact it, perform it, sing it, etc., etc. And I was thinking about how that's kind of how raga is. You know, I'm a sitar player, so we learn ragas. And, you know, ragas have a very strict, you know, arohi, avarohi, ye, wo, everything is there. But every performance is different. Every time an artist picks up a rag, they have to bring it to life in a certain way. It's like that. You know, these kathakars are bringing this Ramayana to life in their way, in bringing their qualities and their ideas to it. But, you know, there'll be Rama and there'll be Sita and there'll be Hanuman and everything will be there. It'll be the Ramayana. But that ability to improvise on themes, like the classical text you can see as a template. Everything else is improvisation and evolution.
Yeah, the same thing. How has your background helped you in as a poet?
I have to say, in precisely these ways, because I don't think there's a very great, there is in fact not a great distance between poetry and music. Because we are, you know, it's ultimately about beat, cadence, pattern. So as a poet, to me, the translation simply has to sing in a certain way, by which I don't necessarily mean it has to hit the high notes. There has to be a musicality to it. And when I'm translating, for instance, that's very much a concern. Tonality, musicality, cadence, how to take these things which are memorable and to try and make them memorable in the new language. I think this is how I would summarize it. Yeah. But also always being attentive to this, to me, not so much as a poet, but also being someone who's been steeped in questions of folkloristics, for instance. It's just the awareness that for every telling that you have, there are many other alternatives. That's like the great narrative penumbra, if you will. So when you look at the illumination, that is the text you're looking at, it also helps to know what's in the shadows. You know, I think that's what really inspires you as a translator.
Thank you. Do you think we should open the house for questions? Yes. Yeah? Plenty of questions.
So thank you so much for such a lovely, such a scintillating session. My question is, so Jumpal, I read My question could be taken by either of the writers present. My question is, so Jhumpa Lahiri in her work, Translating Myself and Others, she does a beautiful comparison of, the original source being equivalent to a sort of narcissist and the translator or the translation being the pursuer or echo. And you spoke very beautifully about how the source need not be a stagnant, or something that we draw from, but a sort of reservoir. And you spoke of tellings rather than versions. Could you kind of elaborate on your take on this perspective of hers a little more?
Jhumpa Lahiri's views come out of a very thoughtful, serious, well-defined perspective. But when I hear that particular metaphor, it reminds me of the Metamorphoses of Ovid, which in fact she's working on. And I have to say personally that is not a model that appeals much to me. And I just want to spell that out very, very briefly. I think there's also behind that, there is Plato's great image of love being the two halves, one eternally pursuing the other. These are all wonderful models. But they tend to rest on a certain lag or lack in which the translation will always be somehow secondary and there is an ur-text or an original. And I think by and large, the model of translation that we've received from, I hate that word, but it's useful, colonial pedagogy, is based on biblical hermeneutics. There is some sense that there is an original word which is sacrosanct, and everything you do is then an approximation. I quite honestly don't think that's how we've ever worked in these parts. There is no notion of a sacrosanct text. The text comes to life in its own moment, depending on desha, kala, patra, the region, the period, and whoever's speaking and who's being spoken to. So I would think of these as not that one model invalidates another, but that some forms might just be more productive in some contexts than others. Having made that whole subject as clear as mud, as one of my friends likes to say, I'm going to turn it over to Srinivas.
Well, I mean, I'll just say this one thing. Well, Jhumpa and I grew up in Rhode Island together, so I think probably growing up, outside of India also affects how one thinks about Indian literature and your relationship to English. One thing I would say, though, generally looking back at our own long tradition in India of translating or transcreating or whatever word you want to give it, is that, in fact, I feel is what has enriched the tradition of that target language. And it has also enriched the source language. Like, Valmiki is enriched, right? When Tulsi writes, Valmiki becomes something else after Tulsi. So in that way, it's like this circular process. So maybe we just kind of blur all these binaries of this and that and just see it as processes of literary evolution. You like that?
Hi, this question is for both of you. Hi there. I'm curious, do you find translating into English very restrictive? As in, translating Indian Eastern languages into the English idiom. And is it restrictive in many ways? Because so many of the ideas and notions and feelings and emotions cannot be precisely translated into English.
No. I mean, yes, to a certain extent, but that can be true of any language when you're translating, So I would say that's part of, the challenge and joy of translating is how am I going to take that sentiment that I see in these words or that image and make it resonate? That's the fun. That, it's like a puzzle. Like a lot of times translating these poems it's like kind of like a puzzle. And I'll tell you, some of these verses I could do 10, 15, 20 in a day, easily. And then one would take me 2 months. Like that.
I was going to cheekily say, ye bada hi peshida sawal hai, Priya ji. But I'm going to drop that. I would say exactly what you said, Srinivas. No, because I think we too often set up this, I don't know what to call it, a straw man or a demon or something. The idea that there is always great loss in translation. There is loss in everything. Loss is part of life. But we need to look at also what might be gained in translation. And there are many things. Actually, that's the challenge and the stimulus of the moment of translation. Also, we tend to flatten out our notion of what English is. English is an evolving language. It's rich, absorbent. It's not what it was 400 years ago. And there are many, many languages within it, as there are in every language. So I would say less demonizing of this notion and more embracing of its possibilities.
Hello, excuse me, sir. Okay. So my question is based on translation. So we understand language based on our own understanding of the word. And especially in the case of ancient languages where the meaning of a word can change very subtly based on the context, how can you determine what the text is actually trying to say in context with your personal understanding of the text?
Well, I go to the Bhashyas. So I look at what the tradition has said over centuries about a particular text. So I think that is critically important, particularly with these classical texts, which do have a lot of commentary on them. So when you read those commentaries, you find that, again, there's not one singular interpretation either. 4 different commentators will say it means this, it means that, it means this. So you balance all of that with your own interpretation, and then you kind of come up with something that you feel comfortable with. But I do believe in honoring a reading of all of those commentators. It's very important.
Absolutely, that. Yeah. These texts don't exist in a vacuum, and you are not working in a vacuum.
Hello. So back in college, I had once used the word dialect, and I kind of got scolded by my professor because
Sorry, what was the word again?
dialect.
Dialect.
Yeah. And so my professor Ipshita Chandu, she told me that so what is a dialect for you can be a language for a whole group of people. So I'm like, no individual is like qualified enough to decide what language is and what dialect is. So how do you feel about it?
Oh, you know the famous quote, right?
A language is a dialect with an army and a navy.
And a navy.
And a navy, too.
Oh, okay. That adds a twist to it. It's true. It's true.
Hello.
No, honestly, this just comes out of a particular understanding of language which is linked to the modern nation state, and where some dominant languages assert their primacy and want to derogate others. So, I mean, this starts more or less in Germany, where Hanover German is taken to be the model, and everybody else gets demoted to Plattdeutsch, identically all over Europe and the UK. And we, for some reason, we think it has ever been thus in India, but so much of how we perceive ourselves is actually through the colonial lens. So all of this, from my point of view, mirthless, unjoyous, and destructive business of linguistic regionalism in India is a colonial legacy.
We just have time for one question, I guess.
Language is culture specific, isn't it? So I think, when we are translating one text in one language into another, giving another version in another language, don't you think, that the cultural component and the content and the nuances get lost, there?
Yeah, some things will get lost, as we had discussed, but then why not see it that there are certain things that are common to cultures? There are feelings, there are emotions, there are situations common to cultures. So hopefully translation allows us to say that, oh yes, this person writing in Upper Brahmsha in 500 is experiencing something very similar to me today. And I think that's something beautiful that happens with translation.
One question from the gentleman there.
Hello. One quick point, which is that you're celebrating the fact that India had multiple classical languages, and we go, say, as David Shulman has pointed out, in the 16th century, you could have someone writing in some combination of Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Sanskrit, right? Multilinguality was the norm, right? So beyond a multi-dialect. But I want to ask about the real place from which we are translating, and what translating literally means to carry across. I feel like as a rural boy in India, there's this invisible barrier. There's one world, the world of English, in which these translations, whatever they mean, whatever these texts mean, there's another world in which I grew up, in which most of my family still lives, in which all of these texts, not just the religious sacred texts, but the literary ones, have a vast amount of meaning. People still quote from them, they make jokes about them, they are still pop up in vernacular literature of today. That world is actually still alive and 500 million people belong to it. It always feels like it's invisible and there's almost no way to connect these two worlds, you know, with this invisible curtain of English. I don't know if you two, or all three of you, since all three of you are translators, think about that.
I'm totally not a translator, so I'll opt out of this. But can we have short answers? Because
Very,
the time-
very short. I think we need to promote the study of Indian languages. We need to speak our own languages. Like, I could speak, I only know Telugu, but if I spoke in Telugu here, not many people would understand. So we have this language of English that we're speaking in. But at home, in opportunities when I can, I speak in my native language. And I think we need to be proud and support that native language training and speaking as much as possible.
Thank
Likewise.
you.
Yep. Very, very
Thank you,
brief
Mr.
word
Reddy.
is-
And Mr. Yeah, please
Yeah.
get.
No, just to say exactly this, that we need to rid ourselves of the monolingualism that's part of our contemporary being. And we have to pull ourselves out of our comfort zones and embrace a kind of xenophilia, you know, a love of what is strange and unfamiliar. And that, I think, lies at the heart of translation.
Thank you so much.